Greg Archuleta is speaking this afternoon about Indigenous peoples' use of fire in prescribed burns. Greg is Clackamas Chinook, Santiam Kalapuya, and Shasta, and a member of the Confederated tribes of Grand Ronde. He is an artist who teaches about the culture and history of the tribes of Western Oregon, including ethnobotany, carving, cedar hat making, native art design, and basketry. His primary focus areas as an artist are carving in the Columbia River native art Chinookan and Western Oregon forms, and traditional and contemporary basketry. Another part of Greg's work is to visit forests, prairies, wetlands, and more through Greater Portland, surveying plants that can be used for food, medicine, art, and materials. I'm going to introduce Greg right now. Please welcome Greg Archuleta.
Sahayam kanaway kilakam, naga mislike kamashush tam naga mislike equaluksan, naga sawaskuliki kilakam. And so first I wanted to kind of welcome you in our tribal language that we use at Grand Ronde today, the Chinook, and just said that I was happy to be here with you all, and then I'm a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. And it's just really good to be here today. Sorry for the little confusion about the start time. But what I want to do today is kind of, I had that to do my little introduction, but Janet gave that little background about me and just the tribes that I'm part of that are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, the Willamette, Tumwater, Clackamas Chinook, Santiam Kalapuya, and Shasta. So pretty much all through Western Oregon, my tribal families are connected to. And just a little background, what I plan to do today is kind of talk a little bit about the tribe's history, so you can be a little familiar with the tribes that we'll be talking about. We'll talk about ancestral use of fires and the traditional foods that are connected to the use of the fire and basketry materials and other things. And then talk about our kind of some of the contemporary kind of issues in regards to fires and what the kind of some of the tribal partnerships the tribes are involved with in regards to fires. So that's kind of how I'll do it, and it's going to be pretty informal today. So if you have questions, just raise your hand, and I think we have plenty of time. So yeah. If you have any questions along the way, just kind of raise your hand and we'll try to address them.
Greg, would you like lights off for this, or would
That's
you prefer?
How's everybody? Can everybody see okay? This slides?
Yeah.
Okay, everybody sees. But as mentioned, I'm a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, and if you're not familiar with Grand Ronde, it's made up of over 30 tribes that were living here in Western Oregon, tribes and bands. And it includes the people of this area, the Clackamas Chinook and the Willamette Tumwaters that lived on east side of the Willamette River. And then the Cascades are Puklala people that lived along the Columbia River from Cascade Rapids, which is now underwater due to Bonneville Dam, but there's a series of rapids there. And actually some of my family comes from that area, and we had fishing places there along the Columbia River, as well as our fishing places, of course, at Willamette Falls, Tumwater, where I'm the direct descendant of Oregon City John, and he was one of that's his English name, but his one of the treaty signers on behalf of the Willamette Tumwaters who lived on the west side of the falls there, today known as the Westland area. And then also on the other side of my family, I'm tied to Chief Wachino, and Chief Wachino signed a treaty on behalf of the Clackamas Chinook, and they lived on the east side of the river. And then, so the Chinookan people, pretty much from Cascade Rapids, 90 miles downriver to a place called Oak Point. At one point, it was on the Washington side, but I think it moved to the Oregon side, or vice versa. But that was the treaty boundary area, so the Chinookan people that lived like in St. Helens, Rainier, those areas, were also relocated to Grand Ronde. So you have quite a large number of Chinookan people that were relocated, Muknomas, also Savis Island area, Monaconsi from the Vancouver area were tied in also, and other Chinookan bands along that 90-mile stretch. And then in the Willamette Valley, of course, you have all the Kalapuya tribes and bands, including the Tualatin Kalapuya and the Hillsboro and Beaverton area, Forest Grove area. They had a large lake there called Wapato Lake in English that there was over 14 different tribal villages there of the Tualatin people. And that lake was actually, after relocation, they actually drained that lake, made it into farming, and now the U.S. Fish and Wildlife is actually restoring that lake, so we hope to see Wapato there again in the future. And then as we go into the valley, Salem area, the Santiam Kalapuya, again they had an area called Lake Labish in English now, but there was a lake there, kind of a wet area where Wapato also grew there. And tribes, the Santiam Kalapuya and Malalos actually go there together, the Wapato and things like that. And then the Santiam were fairly well known for the camas. They always like to say that they had the best camas of all, large bulbs and stuff with the large prairies, wetland areas where it grew very well. And then as you go further south, there's the Marys River, Corvallis area, Long and Eugene area, Yoncallas in southern Oregon. So pretty much throughout the Willamette Valley, the Willamette River and its tributaries were primarily Kalapuya country. And then on the foothills of the Cascades were the Molalla people. And there's different groups such as the Northern Molalla from about Mount Hood area down to Mount Jefferson area. Then you had the Santiam Molallas from Jefferson down to about the Umpqua Valley area. And then the Southern Molalla from Umpqua down into Southern Oregon area. And then in Southern Oregon, we have the Umpqua people along the Umpqua River drains, upper Umpqua River area. And then down in the Medford area, that area you have the Takelma Rogue River people along the Rogue River. And then the Shasta people who are in Southern Oregon there into Northern California. So under different treaties, these different tribes were relocated to Grand Ronde. Some of them were marched. This is we call it Trail of Tears, that actually was from the Rogue River area to the reservation. And then we had even Trail of Tears from this area when the tribes were notified that they would be relocated, where they were marched or sent to Oregon City and other places along the Columbia River, sent to Oregon River, and then by barge they went up to Dayton, and then from there up to the Grand Ronde Reservation. If you're not familiar where Grand Ronde is, it's about halfway between Salem, Oregon, and Lincoln City at the foothills of the Coastal Range. Originally the reservation was about 60,000 acres, and the tribes had different places on their reservation where they were kind of grouped in encampments and things like that originally. And then eventually some of the tribes also went to, from Grand Ronde, like the Rogue River Shastas, and some of them were actually, came to Grand Ronde first, and then they were actually split, and some ended up going to the...
Can you interrupt for just a second? Could you speak up just a little bit louder? It's a little bit hard to hear you.
Okay, I'll try.
Thank you.
And then some of the tribes that were split, and some went to the Siletz Reservation also. So we have families that are connected to both Siletz, Grand Ronde. Is there any questions about the tribal history? Yes.
About when were the treaties signed?
The Willamette Valley Treaty, there was agreements that started in 1851, and those were with the Rogue River Takelma people, and there was actually some temporary reservations that were created, one being at Table Rock in the Medford area, and then one in the Umpqua River area for Umpqua. So there was some early ones before the march to the reservation, and then big treaty, the Willamette Valley Treaty, or also known as the Kalapuya, etc. Treaty of 1855 was when those series of agreements were made with the different tribes. There was actually some treaties that were made in 1851, and it would have had, what the intent was that they wanted to send the tribes to Eastern Oregon. And so they were trying to make those treaties and then remove the tribes to Eastern Oregon. Each and every one of the tribes said, no, we will not go there. We'll die here first. So the agreements ended up having smaller reservations, like the Tualatin Kalapuya would have had one around Wapato Lake and Chehalem area, mountain area. Clackamas had one. The different Kalapuya tribes had one. The Yamp Hills did in Tualatin Kalapuya. So all the Santiam Kalapuya had one. So all through the valley there would have been smaller little reservations for specific tribes. But those treaties of 1851 were not ratified by Congress. They did the new negotiations then through the other treaties, and then Willamette Valley one in 1855. That was ratified by Congress and resulted then in the relocation of the tribes to Grand Ronde. So.
Thank you.
And at Grand Ronde, the reservation was formally established in 1857 by presidential executive order. And then the tribes were relocated there. And then, of course, they tried to make farmers of the tribes, growing wheat and things like that. And initially, that was not very successful. Grand Ronde area, the soil is very clayish, so it wasn't really great for crops and things like that. So, like Tai John and Chipochino, they continued to come to Oregon City and gather fish there, and then they take them by barge and then back up to the reservation. So that was one of the ways that they were able to survive during those early reservation days. The reservation was established, and then in the early 1900s they started to create allotments, so to give individual parcels of land to tribal folks, head of households. And what happened is they gave out those allotments, and then anything that was not allotted, then they decided was going to be called, they declared it surplus. So over half of the reservation was lost to about 26,000 acres of the 60,000 acres was declared surplus, and so that went out of reservation status and sold off. There were a lot of issues happening on the reservations, and then in 1934 came the kind of what was supposed to be like a new agreement where tribes could establish more formal tribal kind of governments. A lot of the earlier forms of governments included votes by the members, and they'd elect their leaders and things like that, and Thais would have a voice and things like that. But under the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, then tribes had the option to adopt constitutional forms of government, so more like the government you see in Oregon and the U.S. today. And most of the tribes in Oregon adopted those except one, I can't remember, as maybe Umatilla or Warm Springs didn't. But with that, then the constitution was established for the tribes, and then they established like tribal councils and a business council and things like that. But everything came to abrupt end in 1954 with the Western Oregon Termination Act. And that impacted pretty much all the tribes of Western Oregon in regards to where, with the passage of that act, the tribes of the reservation was to be shut down. Relocation dollars were given, so a one-way pass essentially for tribal members if they didn't want to stay in Grand Ronde, to move to Portland, Seattle, Denver, San Francisco, LA, etc. And then essentially the tribal folks were not recognized then as Native people by the federal government. And that happened in 1954 to our tribe. The result was that pretty much a lot of the allotments too were taxable after about 20 years, so a lot of the tribal folks lost their lands because of that issue. And then with the closing of the reservation, the tribe retained about 5 acres, which was our tribal cemetery that we held on to. And then in 1983, In the 1970s, the tribe saw some successes with restoration. There was the Menominees back east, and then the Silex got recognized, so the tribe worked on it in the 70s, and in 1983 got recognized by the federal government. And since that time, then our tribe has pretty much been in a rebuilding phase, rebuilding our community for the housing. Now we have tribal housing, elder housing, we have elder care, we have health service clinic there, we have education services, cultural center, and then actually I work today, we have an office here in Portland, and I work out of that office. That's why I was able to get here so quickly. And then, so we've been pretty much rebuilding. Today, most people know Spirit Mountain Casino, so that's a tribe's casino that we operate. And so that's kind of a quick overview of the tribe's history. Is there any questions?
Was there ever, I just heard a bit about Native Indian schools in like North Dakota, but did Oregon or this area have versions of that?
Yes, and if you're not familiar, there's still an operating boarding school here in Oregon. That's Chamala Indian School in Salem. That actually started out in Forest Grove and then was relocated to Salem, and that's still existing. One, and a lot of our tribal folks where the children, as soon as they got to a certain age, they were required to go to the boarding school at Chamala. And my mom was one of those. She ended up going there for a couple of years to Chamala, and a lot of our elders today still remember those experiences, and we still have some students that kind of decided it's changed a little bit from the earlier days, but we still have youth that go to Chamala.
Is it run by the tribe or the Confederated tribes?
The school is run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They do have an advisory board of tribal folks, but the school is day-to-day is run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So that's still in existence here today. Yes?
During the reclamation period of time, we have a lot of urban Indians return to reservations.
Yeah, that was one of the things is with the termination, a lot of tribal folks moved out of the area. We mentioned the one-way bus passes essentially that they were given, and then as the tribe was able to secure lands in Grand Ronde, we were actually returned about just under 10,000 acres of the original reservation, but that was all timberland, and that was to be used for like a revenue source for us. We had to still keep the timber management plan that they had for the area for 20 years. So we had revenue coming in from that, and with that we started purchasing other lands in the Grand Ronde community, and that's where we have our the housing and our governmental buildings and things like that. And so with that and the housing and stuff, like we started elder housing first, and then family housing. We've had a lot of tribal members now returning to the reservation, and we're just about to, I think, start some new housing again for so other tribal folks can return if they'd like.
Just wanted to say thanks for coming to talk to us and taking the time to do this. And I was just wondering if there's any organizations that are actively in a reparations conversation of returning land or any process like that happening?
There's not specifically a lot. One is through impact of the dams and things like that, in regards to, you know, like impacts to fishing areas, traditional fishing areas and things like that. The Bonneville Power Administration has some projects where we can secure some of the former lands back, and then most of those are set aside for conservation or fisheries enhancement, landscape. Like we have areas like that we're working like to restore oak savanna kind of areas, meadows, prairies, things like that. Some along the Santiam River that we have, where we're doing a lot of restoration work and then tied to fisheries and things like that. So we have those different parcels of land. I think we're just under 1,000 acres now of the lands that we've been able to get through that program. But right now that's been the primary. unless the tribe purchases. Any other questions on that? Well, I come to tell you that Coyote got himself in trouble a long time ago. And I can't tell you the whole story because it's summertime and we always hold the old stories until winter time. So this is kind of an interior of our tribal plank house at Grand Ronde today. And just kind of use this for the economy or the old story kind of piece that I'll be sharing with you today. But Coyote was going along and they didn't have fire. And Snake, I believe, was holding the fire and being kind of selfish and kind of a lot of the high status people could have fire, but the lower class people couldn't. So one day, Coyote decided he would just steal that fire, ball of fire. And so he went up and he tricked Snake and stole that fire. And as he was running away and being pursued, he'd throw the ball of fire up in the air, run, and then catch it. So as he's running away doing that, he kept doing that. As he got close to his village, then the people saw what he was doing and they said, don't do that, don't throw it up. But Coyote continued to do it. And so he threw that ball of fire up, and then he stumbled and fell, and the fireball hit the ground. And the land was all on fire. And due to that fire, a lot of the people at that time, the animal people, they died. But there was the kind of a black-headed bird, like the junco, came along and was able to revive the people. So it's just a little story to tell that from a tribal perspective, fire has been around for a very long time. And for a tribal perspective, you know, it's been an important resource for us. And like a lot of things, fire is considered like a living being. A lot of people see rocks, things like that as inanimate. But to tribal folks, all those things have life, including fire. And when we do special things, we're having ceremony, our meals and stuff, we be sure that we feed that fire. So there's a relationship between the tribal people, the animals, and the fire. And there's always been that connection for our people. And so fire had many different uses for us. And it helped with hunting, because the fires would go through and bring new grasses for the deer and elk. It would be used for some of the foods, like tarweed. The areas, tarweed, if you're not familiar, is like a wild sunflower. It's a small wild sunflower. I'll show you in a minute. But those tarweed had a tarry substance on them. And so before they would gather the tarweed, they would burn the fields first. And then that would burn off that tarry substance, and then they would knock the seed into baskets. So that's a very important, useful tool of fire. Fire was also used for like camas areas, for prairies, to kind of keep them open. Because if we weren't able to keep those prairies open, things would disappear, like the camas, huckleberry areas, the hunting areas, the berries for huckleberries and things like that. So fire was used for those kind of purposes also. We have, besides foods, traditional basket materials, and one of the primary of the Willamette Valley here being hazel stick, the wild hazel, which has got a really nice flexibility in it. And so areas would be kind of burned to encourage new growth for the hazel. A lot of the berries were used, and then the perimeters, and the prairies that were burned, and then bringing light to the perimeter of the forest also, bringing like service berries and other kind of foods like that that needed more sunlight and shade, kind of a mixture of that to grow well, like the huckleberries. So fire had really a lot of uses by the tribes. And I'll kind of go in more detail here as we go along. And then after contact, well, the landscape will show you. So at the time of contact, when the first explorers and people came, other people from other areas came here, they saw kind of an area that was very mixed, but you had these very big open prairies, you had the oak savannas, by the rivers and creeks you had the forested areas, which were good like for hunting for the deer and elk and things like that. But the early paintings, these were in the 1840s, where some of the artists, such as Paul Kane, Gibbs, and them, they did these paintings of the landscape here in western Oregon, of the Willamette Valley. And you can see through them all kind of the diversity of the landscape, where you have these big, wide open areas, but you also have the corridors of the forest areas. So they were very mixed. You have the oak savanna kind of areas like that. This one was just by Ware, and it was titled just the Willamette Valley, I believe. So you can kind of see what the kind of the landscape looked like at contact. Here's the Willamette River. I think this is in the Yamhill River area. You can see. But at the time of contact, there was a lot of burning going on by the tribes. And if you've read very many journals, you'll see that they talk about those fires. Some of the trappers and then the early settlers would talk about them throughout Oregon. There's stories about in the Yamhill area, the fires that would be done about August, September. A lot of those were early on were for like the tar weed like that, keeping the hunting grounds open and things like that. So you had the Yamhill area down by Dallas, Oregon, Salem area. You had them talking about the fires happening. Eugene area and the Umpqua area. All these kind of things talking about the fires. And one of the things that was noted is how the tribes would start those fires, but they had kind of like, one of them said like an imaginary line where that fire didn't cross to where they wanted to keep the forest and things like that. And so the tribes had techniques of how to burn the landscape for that kind of purpose. And these fires were fairly frequent. They were, some of them were every year, like when you're growing the tar weed, then that was kind of an every year kind of fire. But if you were burning for other purposes, like the hazelnuts or the huckleberries and things like that, maybe for some of the Camas prairies, they would do those maybe every 3 years or so. But these were fairly routine things. One of the more now known, especially for plant people, David Douglas. If you've read his travels through Western Oregon, and he talks about as he's going south, the fires, and so everywhere he's going, it's burned up, and he's trying to gather plant samples. So he wasn't very happy going along. And the other thing that was an issue was that for the horses, because the burn had stubble, so it was kind of hard on the animals. And then there's no grazing area for the animals unless they were by the streams and rivers where the corridors were. So in our journals, they kind of complain about that a lot, about the fires, and kind of almost following the fires as they go down Western Oregon. But one of the things that David Douglas noted that on his return trip later in the year, the rains had come and the grasses had started. So that already the landscape changed from the burnt areas to the green, lush green of those from those fires and the rains and things. That was kind of some of the things that they recognized that happened with the fires. The other thing was they have stories and tell about where you could ride through different forest areas, and they were fairly open. There was not a lot of brush because they would do those low burning fires, search some of those areas and oak groves and things like that. So it was fairly brush free. A lot of the Cascade foothills and stuff like that were very similar, where you had these more kind of diverse kind of opens of, say, oak and madrone and kind of plants like that. There'd be camas growing in there, lilies would be grown in there, some of the bulbs, wild onions and things like that, because they had enough sunlight coming through. A lot of these features were where there were basalt rocks, but they kept those kind of areas open, and they were used by some of the trails that the tribes used and things like that. So pretty much throughout the Willamette Valley and the foothills, as you go up into the headwaters of some of the rivers, it'd kind of be like that, much more open than what we see today. So I mentioned camas, and camas has been coming back. I don't know, has people have been, well, most of you seen camas in the valley during the springtime? So you know what the flower looks like. But it's the bulbs that are gathered, and this one is at a place that we call Camas Prairie. This is up above Sweet Hole. And it's a prairie where we can gather the camas bulbs, and there's lily there. There's some of the other bulbs, such as the brodias and hyacinths. There's juncus there. Juncus is a rush that we use in basketry that grows, and this area has a nice little spring of where that juncus grows. But the bulbs are what the tribes gather. So this is the bulbs of the camas. And the camas was pretty widespread throughout western Oregon, and so used by a lot of our tribes throughout the region. As I mentioned, the Santiam, it was a big, not only food for subsistence, but also for trade. The bulbs would be gathered, and it would vary depending on location. Some of the areas, if you're not familiar, also has death camas, which is the white camas. So you had to be pretty careful and know if there was any death camas around, because if you did eat too much or consume too much of that camas, you would actually die from it. And there's diaries from the pioneer journals and stuff like that where they came across it and ate it, and people died. And we actually had an incident last year where some kids found some, and they thought it was onions, wild onions, and they fortunately unfortunately they got sick, but they didn't die from it. But still, today you really do have to be careful and really know when you're out to gather the camas, know whether or not there's a dead camas in there. But the yes,
How is the camas bulb prepared normally?
Yeah, that's what I was just going to get into, is that we go out and traditionally we use sticks, and they are made out of yew, or down south they might use the mountain mahogany. Other types of wood would be used to make the stick, and then it had the elk handle on top, and you had a little curve in it, and then you just put that down in the ground and kind of pop up the bulbs. It's much harder to do today because a lot of the areas don't get as much use, and so the ground is a lot harder, and so it's a little harder to kind of dig into the ground. But they'll gather them that way, and gather the bulbs, and then traditionally they'd have like a ground oven, And so what they would do is they put heated hot rocks, they got whole pit heated hot rocks in there. And then they put a layer of leaves of maybe hazel, ash, maple. So the layer of leaves in there, and then they put the camas bulbs in there. And sometimes these were fairly large ovens, and so they have multiple families that were doing this together. So they put another layer of leaves, more camas, more leaves, more camas, like that. And then when they're ready to, then they would put some leaves on, and then cover that with dirt. And then the heat from those hot rocks would essentially bake the camas bulbs. And one of the things is if you try to eat the camas bulbs raw, or if you don't cook it correctly, it can give you a lot of stomach problems because it's kind of an insulin type thing that's just not made digestible. But by the baking process of the camas ovens and preparing it that way, it actually turns that insulin, caramelizes those bulbs and kind of converts those insulin sugars into more digestible forms. So I don't know if many of you read the digests or journals of Lewis and Clark, and they tell about trading for camas, and then they have stomach and gas problems because they really didn't know how to prepare it correctly. And then once they were baked like that, tribes would use it, store it for a primary winter food source or for trade. And so then they would be often dried out in the sun and then mashed and then prepared into larger cakes. And they would store it. It stores very well. So they could store it for winter, or they'd make them into trade cakes. And the Kalapuya used kind of circular cakes for that purpose. And then they would be a trade item, like the Tualatans or Santiam could go to places like Oregon City, trade for fish, dried fish and things like that. So there's a lot of trade happening between the tribes all through western Oregon. Oregon City being one of the primaries, and Salem areas, and then southern Oregon, different trade areas. So what was important in regards to fire in camas was that keeping open those prairies. They're not cared for. Other things will encroach. Today we are familiar with like Douglas fir. If they're not cared for, Douglas fir will encroach and take out those prairies. We have areas like Camas Prairie I mentioned, and there's an ash grove at one end. And that ash is pretty prolific with its seed, so it gets blown into the prairie area there. And so we work with the Forest Service, Willamette National Forest, and they burn that area every so often. Hopefully this year will be a burn if we're able to, depending on how the weather goes in the fall time. But they were hoping last year but couldn't, so I don't know if they'll be able to this year, but hoping to later in the fall. We have areas up in higher mountain ranges too, where we have like the camas areas, and we actually have huckleberry encroaching on the prairie. Usually they're on the perimeter, but they're actually encroaching on the prairie. So just if you're trying to keep those foods, then being able to burn those and manage them. You had a question there?
Yeah, I was wondering about the time probably during the summer, right? The burning times. Was there a specific?
Yeah, usually the burning was in September and October, unless it was for another kind of specific purpose. September through August, September, maybe October. A lot of the accounts from the pioneers was usually in the August, September period. So that's kind of in regards to fire, its importance for the prairies and stuff like that. If you're not familiar with a lot of those prairies, what happens is that during the early part of the year, springtime, they're fairly wet and they're damp, and then as really pretty much through their growing period and the flowering period, they're usually damp and wet, have moisture, and then right after that, then the areas will tend to dry out for the summer and things like that, but the bulbs are down there and they're fine. But that moisture is important for those camas areas.
I understand that the Willamette Valley has large camas prairies, and that a lot of that has been disrupted. And I was wondering about in restoration and the work that the tribe is doing is there a map system of the prairies, and is there in particular, like stewarding and protection of the Camas prairies through the tribes and also with the state?
Yeah,
What
that's
does
a
that look like?
good question. That's what I spend a lot of my time doing. I actually, I work for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. I work in our Cultural Resources Department, and I actually work up here in Portland, but I work with a lot of our partners up here. And that's kind of one of the things that I've been working on, and then I have another person that works with me, Chris. And we've been able to go out and do some mapping of the different areas. We're always kind of monitoring and watching to see how the plants are doing. Like in those prairies, you only have camas, but there's tarweed in there. There's yampa, if you're not familiar with yampa. It's kind of a white flower like the Queen's Anne's lace, but the root is edible. And so that's another important food source of the tribes of Western Oregon and elsewhere. And then the oaks and things like that. So we're always kind of monitoring, kind of watching, and we've been developing inventories of the different sites. And then we work with different partners, like for this area, we work a lot with Metro. We have a place up here called Quamish Prairie, out towards Beaverton area. And it has, for instance, the yampa and lots of camas and some tarweed and things like that. And that was one of the areas the tribes worked with to cooperatively burn that area. We did a couple of years ago, and I'll show you some photos in a little bit of that area burning that we did in partnership with Metro. And then we're hoping to do some more burning there, but we're just waiting for the circumstances to be right, and hope to do that. We've been out in Southern Oregon visiting with the BLM on some of their sites, and we're looking to do some partnerships there for burning and things like that. The tribe has worked a lot with the Nature Conservancy. We've done some burns at Cascade Head a few years ago. I think we've worked with them at Table Rock in the past. So pretty much throughout the state, when the tribe is able to, then we kind of work in partnership with the Willamette National Forest and Camas Prairie too, Love Sweet Home, that area too, working with them on that when they do that fire. And the tribe is really working, and we're hoping that we'll be able to kind of develop our resources more so that we can do a lot more of the fires and the prescribed burns, and working with different partners and agencies to do that.
What's your perspective, or the tribe's perspective, on smoke? We have so many, air quality warnings and things like that, but I imagine smoke used to be so much thicker in the past.
Yeah, and there's a difference, I think, between today's fires and the fires of the past. And when I show you the prescribed burn, I'll talk about that a little bit. But today, these fires are happening to a much greater extent, and historically, because the tribes burned a lot of areas, which would reduce the amount and intensity of fires that happen today. And that's one thing I know some of the early pioneers noticed. When they first got here, they could ride through a lot of different areas and not worry about brush and things like that, because the fires the tribes did kind of kept all those areas clear. But after relocation and stuff like that, and the tribes were not present, then the brush came up right away. Within 20 years, they were talking about the heavy brush and talking about places where they used to be able to ride through, but they couldn't anymore because of a lack of fire. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit.
Could you repeat the name of the area near Beaverton where you said there was a burn? And you were talking about all the different burns, where you said there was one near Beaverton?
Quamish Prairie, it's called. It's a metro parcel, and Grand Ronde and other tribes are involved there, and kind of planning for its restoration and work there.
Okay, Quamish.
Quamish, it's what it's called, yeah. I think on the map when you do, I think it's called that on the metro map now.
Okay, thank you.
Over here. So another plant that I mentioned earlier is tarweed or wild sunflower, and there's different varieties of it. And this was actually a very, very common plant in the Willamette Valley due to the tribes using it extensively. But after contact, because of that tarry substance on it I mentioned, a lot of the livestock people didn't really like it, and so there was pretty much a process of eradicating it throughout western Oregon, Willamette Valley. Today, there's just kind of scattered populations of it. But the tarweed is a wild sunflower as a small kind of seed that was used by the tribes, and we still use it today. But it's a small seed, and what would happen is the tribes, when they were ready to gather it, this was usually in August, September, is they would go out to those tarweed patches, they would set them on fire, it would burn off that tarry substance. And then they had like a fan, seed fan, and this is actually an old one from, that was is Santiam Kalapuya, and actually this ended up in the long story in the British Museum. But the tribe was actually able to get it on loan for a little bit, and we actually recreated these. It's pretty amazing, because if you look at this, it's got this crazy twist in it. And you're wondering how that happened, and as you make the seed fan, it actually kind of naturally does that. So this one's pretty old. This was collected from the Grand Ronde Reservation in 1887. It's been not long after that when it ended up in the British Museum. So very old, and it was really nice to get it returned. But what happens when after the tarweed is burned, then they'd use these seed fans to hit the tarweed, and it would knock them into different types of baskets that were used then to collect them. Most of these are known as kind of like burden baskets, different kind of types. Again, these are old, and these are part of the Summers collection too that ended up in the New England British Museum. These were carried when they had a strap on their forehead, and then carried on the back. But when they're gathering the seed, they have them in front, and then they use the seed fan to knock the seed into these baskets. These baskets were made out of hazel and juncus and sometimes maple. Actually, for design, maple bark would be used, and they'd actually dye the bark of the maple bark for some of the design. You can see it a little bit on here. But they would gather those, and then sometimes the outer shell of the seed would not come off yet. So what they would do, they'd have different types of basketry, including an ash, like this is an ash bark bucket, and then they had them made out of ash, or they had them made out of maple bark. And then they'd put hot coals in there, they'd put the seed in there, and still have the shell on, and then they'd keep them moving not to burn the basket, and then crack that outer shell, and then they'd winnow out the shells. So they have these type of baskets. This one again is Tualatin. Other tribes, like in southern Oregon, they might use more of a flatter basket that's just flat, and put the hot coals on there and just keep it moving. Those were primarily tools used as part of the tarweed gathering basket. And then those shell would be removed, then it would be ground into a flour, and then it would often be stored for winter times, and oftentimes they would mix it with like berries, different types of berries, like blackberries or huckleberries, and then they would, or with hazelnuts, and mix them in with those. So it was a relatively important food source for the tribes of Western Oregon. Very common pretty much throughout the Willamette Valley, through the Kalapuya tribes, the Rogue River, Yonquwa people. all had their tarweed areas. And these areas were pretty important to the tribes, and some of them were tied to specific families and things like that. So then the fire was pretty much tied to the actual gathering of the food. And the huckleberries up in the mountains, down lower elevation, you have the red huckleberries. If you haven't had them, they're kind of tart. And those would just be kind of more eaten fresh. Then you have the mountain huckleberries and wild blueberries. And the berries, they need kind of a mixture of sunlight and shade. So if you have a thick forest, they're not going to do well. You need it kind of more open. Trees not so close together and things like that, a lot more light. Very important for the tribes. A lot of our tribes would travel to the mountains during the summer, and actually this is the period when we're usually up in the mountains. I've been up there the last couple weeks gathering huckleberries. These were then gathered up, and then they would had a kind of different methods, but like they gather the huckleberries and they color the wild blackberries. And what they would do is kind of during the nighttime they would start fires and put the berries on cleaned off bark, and they'd set those by the fires during the night, and then in the daylight they'd let the sunlight help dry them out. So they were drying them out, and then they would be kind of ground up and then saved into cakes and things like that, or just kept like that, and then reconstituted during the wintertime as a important wintertime food, where they could just add water and put it in their soups or stews or whatever they were going to mix with it. Very important, and fire was important for trying to keep those areas open. So trying to keep them maintained so there wasn't a lot of new growth that was taking out the shade and things like that. A lot of times you can have them on the borderline between the forest and the prairie areas or open meadow areas. So they work to keep those open so that those berries continued to grow. These areas would probably be burned more like maybe on a 3-year rotation versus every year. And there's lots of other berries. I mentioned the wild blackberries were a very important food resource. And for those, you need kind of a more open area, not much shade if you want them to do well. And this year, there was actually a lot of them, probably because of the heat and stuff like that. I've seen a lot more riper blackberries out there. But they do need that good sunlight, nice open area, and you'll get a lot more riper berries. And so the tribes had different areas where they would care for them. Strawberries would be another one, usually in the meadows and prairies too, for lots of berries. I'm thinking of a place up on Mary's Peak where I seen them in a meadow a few years ago, so I got to go check and see how that meadow's doing. I don't know if it's encroaching or not, but there's, I know, some areas up there where there were lots of strawberries, so to go check it out again and see how it's doing. The Clackamas, they had a place at Gladstone, an open area that they used, and was a regular wild strawberry gathering area. I got Wapato. I'll just show you Wapato, but this grows in the ponds and sloughs, so the tuber is used for food, not very common up in this area along the Columbia River where there's a lot of ponds and sloughs, and the tuber is used, and it's kind of, they also call it the Indian potato. It's kind of a small tuber, kind of like a potato, and you kind of put it on the hot coals and bake it. But since these are in more wetter areas, more probably just keeping so you can get to them, and so you have access to them for use of fire. This is a kind of a cap tribal folks would use, and it's kind of a cap from a deer. And what they would do is use this kind of as a disguise. And so they put those on with the horns on them. But what happened though is for the hunting areas, I mentioned that they would use fires to kind of keep the areas open for our burn areas. So there was good grazing for the deer and elk and animals, waterfowl. But another method that they did is they'd actually use fires during the time when they wanted to do hunting. And what would happen, and this was probably a much older tradition as contact came to be, it was a lot harder to do this, but they would actually have these huge deer elk roundups. And one tells about the roundup being as large as Marion County as an example, where the numerous different tribes would work together and create these different fires, and it would force the deer into certain areas, and then they would be easier to get the deer and elk. And they would usually do this in the fall time to get their winter meat. So they'd have these huge fires, forcing the deer and elk into certain locations, be able to get them there, and then the deer and elk meat would be distributed throughout the different tribes, depending on where they were and how successful they were at getting the animals. So this was pretty huge. You can imagine the size of a county and all these fires happening, the number of deer and elk that would have been there for them to get. So it's just kind of incredible thinking about the work that went into doing something like that. Usually there was one tribal leader that was responsible for the whole thing, and then they'd work with the other different tribes and bands and kind of coordinate it so it was successful. But there's kind of old stories about this that our tribal folks have. We have a couple people here. So this is Alkama, or John Hudson, and he was Santiam Kalapuya, and he was one of those. And this is actually drawn during the treaty time. There's a pencil drawing of him. But he was one of those that told about those big hunts happening in the Willamette Valley. And we have descendants of his today that still hunt and fish and carry on some of the traditions. Another person is Quinneby. He lived in the Salem area and also talked about these big hunts. So here historically, as the tribes were on the landscape, they were able to do these fires on a regular basis, and then after removal, a lot of these fires stopped. You have the allotments and people getting lands and ownership and things like that. So you only had people with property and stuff like that, and some wouldn't allow the tribes to go to those areas. Plus the removal made it much more difficult for the tribes to be able to do these burns and conduct them. But what's happened in the last few years is there's become the recognition of how important these fires are to the landscape. And so people are now doing a lot of work, often working with tribes to kind of bring back these different types of fires. And there's different types of fires that occur. They're not intense like the wildfires. They would happen on a regular basis. And then the intensity of them would be a lot lower, especially if you do them on a more regular basis where that intensity would not happen. You could have a fire, for instance, in the oak grove area, and they do those on a regular basis, so we'll just burn those grasses and things, but not not really harm the tree, but it would help the tree because it wouldn't get the insects and things that were on there. So it helped reduce the insect population that would like to eat the acorns, like the grubs and things like that. So that fire was used for that purpose also. There's also stories about some of the tribes that can gather grasshoppers or caterpillars from the ash trees, and they would burn areas and then collect up the grasshoppers and things like that. So that was another use for the fires. But as the attention has come to it, and a lot of attention has come to the Willamette Valley and the regular fires that Kalapuya had. But there's a lot happening throughout Oregon and Northern California with the California tribes. And the California tribes have been working on this a lot more with like the Forest Service and things like this. And so they have crews that can actually go out and do these fires. They have families that go out and they have different gathering areas, maybe for hazel or for the berries, etc. And so these families will go out and do these fires. They're doing different management techniques to kind of care for the different landscapes and the different plants, and for the animals, like for hunting purposes and things like that. But this is, I mentioned Quamish Prairie, and this is a fire that we did here a couple years ago, working in cooperation with Metro. And here you can see the flames on the ground. This is the first time this area has been burned in a very long time. There's a lot of non-native plants in there, and that was kind of one of the purpose of doing this, was to kind of be able to impact those non-native plants that were competing with the camas, tarweed, yamba, etc. The tribe worked with Metro, and the tribe actually, our Natural Resources Department, they actually did the fire plan for this. So they developed a plan and how it would be burned, etc. This one was not very large. It was more to be kind of a demonstration to see what could happen in the future. But I was kind of being a slowpoke. I guess you guys know that's a slowpoke today, but getting there, and as I was going there, there's like that first picture where you see all kinds and tons of smoke going up in the air. But one of the things they plan for is how the weather's going to be for that day and where the wind's blowing. You know, of course, you don't want it blowing into neighborhoods and things like that. So they kind of plan for that, and that's part of the fire planning. Is that they'll target days when there'd be certain weather conditions. But as I was driving towards this, you could see the smoke, and it was going pretty much straight up in the air as they did this burn. And you see them here, they're starting the perimeter. They have fire lines. So then this is what it kind of looks like after. But by the time I got to there, they were wrapping up the burning part, and this is what the landscape looked like. And you can see there's not a lot of smoke at all. So just during that short period of time where they had initially a lot of smoke going up, by the time I got there, there was no smoke left. And the ground was actually getting fairly cool. You think there'd be a lot of critters and things like that would catch up. But as we walked through this area, after we let it cool down a little more and start walking through there to see the impact of the fire, you had a lot of like snakes and stuff that had been low enough in the ground they knew how to escape from that kind of fire, and they were scurrying around. There were some insects that didn't make it; they got roasted on the some of the plants and things like that. But you had some of the critters that were able to survive and knew how to survive from these fires. So it was pretty amazing.
How do they put the fires out?
These fires are just made to be, I think, self-extinguishing, and then they just watch for hot spots. So that's why they're doing a perimeter and work it in, so then it just collides and there's nothing else to burn. And then they watch the perimeter and inside too for any hot spots. So they have a crew that kind of just, after it's burned, then they'll just stay there and watch for the hot spots. And so this was a kind of a good example of one of those fires happening, and just seeing the landscape then afterwards, and then be able to walk through and see the critters that survived through. Because most folks would probably think that everything got killed or burned during that process, but that really didn't happen. And then the smoke management too, is watching how that really and that's really one of the important things because of the issues with smoke and health hazards and things like that. That when they're planning these types of fires, that they really keep that in mind and are looking for the best conditions so that smoke can dissipate fairly rapidly, trying not to get them into families, neighborhoods and things like that. I think it's much different than, I remember when I used to be able to burn the wheat fields and stuff like that, and everything would get pretty smoky and things like that, it's different than those type of fires that were happening too, and that's, kind of led to the banning these types of fires and things like that, or not using them because of that concern of the health hazards. I was going to show you a little video. This one. But this is kind of the burn landscape, and just kind of looking, that's not a very good one, but of the tarweed. So this is after the fire, and I got some tarweed where the tarweed was burned as part of that fire, and then they're collecting some of the seed. I wasn't doing a great job. I was doing a sample, but the wind was blowing pretty good by then, and so half my seed was flying away, replanting the landscape. But you can see then how easy it is to kind of gather the seed after that fire went through. Just knocking it with my hands and gathering seed. So that was just a little example I did after that fire that day. Is there any questions? Yes?
Is there a fire council with the Confederated Tribes of Oregon? And are you, you've mentioned building up your resources again. Is there tribal collaboration between the California tribes who have done more work with partnerships or Washington?
And actually what we're doing is kind of working towards that. We've had a lot of discussion. Tribal folks are really interested in the fires and be able to do those and being involved in them. And some of the work that we're doing in Southern Oregon is we hope that within the next few years, we're looking at the things like fire certification, how families can do family fires, and those kind of activities. And we're working with different partners in Southern Oregon to make that happen. We actually have hopes of working with the BLM on some of their areas. We also have private landowners and nonprofits, like we have Vesper Meadows down in Southern Oregon, where they have big areas they're working on restoration, and we're working with them to hopefully do some fires during the next few years. So we're working on that and hoping to get more people fire certified and things like that also. Yes?
Go ahead.
And you talk about trying to build up the resources. I think we should be putting in the resources to make that happen. So is there a place we donate for that work to help it along?
Right now, we're just working through different partners. And the focus is that, like in Southern Oregon, because of removal and relocation to the Grand Ronde, and this is actually a project with Grand Ronde and Siletz. We're working with Southern Oregon University, kind of being our facilitator and connecting us with lots of different partners down there. But those different partner groups like Vesper Meadows, the Siskiyou group, and many others down there that we're working with in partnership. And right now we're just kind of doing a visit of the different tribal their lands and stuff like that, and see what the opportunities are and stuff like that. I mentioned Vesper because that's one we've worked with most so far down there, and they're very open to doing some fires and things like that. That is an example of what we'll probably do with other partners also. And historically, we've done that with the Nature Conservancy also.
Are there any fire certification programs that you would recommend?
Right now I don't, because we're just kind of gathering information. And I know they have some stuff happening where I know the UROC or KUROC are kind of doing their own kind of certifications now. And I think there's an Intertribal Fire Council and things like that, where I think they're going to start pushing for the opportunities for tribal members to get that certification. So there's kind of a lot of happening. The state of Oregon has the fire specialists. There's one for Northern Valley and then for Southern Oregon. And so working with them also, they're kind of what our partners too, and looking at different opportunities that we can have through them, and they're stationed out of OSU. Yes?
Pre-contact, how long were tribal peoples using these practices? How long were tribal peoples living it?
And at the beginning, I told the econom, which is pretty much from time immemorial. So that, as long as we've been connected to the land, I think we've been using these different techniques. And it's changed over time. We know archaeological, 6,000 to 9,000 years, 14,000 years that the tribes have been here, present on the landscape, what they say from the archaeological, and they keep extending that out as they learn more and more. But the sites that they dated and stuff like that, show that the use of the gathering of the canvas and things like that have been around for a very, very long time. Thousands and thousands of years.
I know for me, thinking about contact forward 150 years, and then talk about restoration practice within the context of 16,000 years. It just really rearranges my mind.
Mind-boggling. And then another part of that is we're always looking to, you hear Native people say 7 generations, always looking to the future. And a lot of these projects that we work on, we may not be able to, say, gather the canvas or the Wapato today, but we're always hoping and working towards that future when we'll be able to. There's a lot of plants that our tribes use historically that are in low numbers, and a lot of that can be because of a lack of fire, like a lot of the other bulbs, the brodias and wild onions and things where that fire is also important. But the plants, cat's ear, lilies, they were very common and commonly used by the tribes. Today we don't gather much of those because of their rarity, and we're just kind of like for the most part, like in a monitoring, or if we're just gathering small populations where there's a good population. But a lot of those, we don't gather. We're just more in a monitoring state, and hopefully that those populations will increase and improve to once again in the future where there'll be enough population that we can actually gather in a day again. And then that also leads me to think about our tribal nursery. The tribe started a tribal nursery, and so some of these plants we're growing now, and we're working with different partners also again for to use plants from our nursery for planting, replanting, restoration efforts, and then we use them on the reservation also. So we have kind of those different activities happening.
Are the meadows that you are, recording or mapping out, are they on public lands or private also, or?
Yeah, there's a mixture of private property, private and public, yeah. Uh-huh.
What are your largest barriers to setting fires besides private lands, and are there legal, even with the burns and smoke for having the right conditions and?
Oh, yeah,
How is it to navigate
yeah.
that?
And it's, usually when you're doing that, you're not doing it alone, you're working with a lot of different agencies and partners. Like for the Clackamas Prairie, I think we worked with the county fire departments up there, the local fire departments. And so they kind of have to sign off on those plans and things like that. And they're looking at those kind of issues of when the fire will be, where the smoke will be blowing, those kinds of things, making sure that you're burning an area that doesn't have any other kind of unhealthy things, contaminants that when they burn, might be a health hazard. So all those kind of conditions and things are looked at as they develop that fire plan. And they're all incorporated and working with the different agencies. So you work with the fire department, work with the state forestry department, with the metro people. So it's really a team of people that are looking at that fire plan as it's developed.
Well, there's a 50-acre Camas Meadow near the town of St. Helens that
Yes.
I hope is on your map.
Yeah, I've seen the concern everybody has about that being lost and stuff like that. So I've seen it, but I haven't been able to get out there yet.
There's Wampa
very
there
warm,
too.
yeah.
There's Wampa.
Yeah, so, yeah. And we have lots of areas like that. I don't know if you heard this past year, there were some places in Eugene. There's a place outside of Harrisburg that was being under development. And so some of our tribal folks did go out and get some of the canvas bulbs and things before the development happened. So, uh-huh.
I don't know if this is a dumb question, but can fire only be used as a tool in open spaces, or could it also be used in a forest to prevent bigger fires, or?
Yeah, and that was one of the things, when these fires are happening on a regular basis, right now it's pretty dangerous because the brush has been growing up, and so there's a lot more, risk of burning the trees and things like that. But historically, those fires were happening at such a regular scale that the grass, was at a certain level. There wasn't a lot of heavy brush in there already, and they were trying to prevent that. So those fires could go in that forest and just burn those grasses and things like that without having a huge fire that's burning the trees also. So what's going to happen is where you're back to that landscape where you can have those fires burn through like that on a low level without harming the trees. Historically, the tribes were able to do that. And I know some of the settlers kind of talk about that, where they've seen the fire go through and it didn't really impact the trees. It was just burning that grass on the ground. But today there's just so much brush and everything in there that it's going to be really hard to not burn the trees, and that's what we see happening now. Why there's so much devastation from the wildfires today is because of all the brush and everything that's built up over the years, creating these really intense fires.
That's what I wanted to ask you about. I'm in the Malala area and we evacuated last year, and part of my curiosity is how do we do this work so we can care for the land? It seems like this is like the back, the buildup of so much not caring for the land properly, and obviously that's a big historical piece. But just hearing what you think about how to be in this moment where it's really extreme.
Yeah, and that's why, for tribal folks, we're really trying to get up so we can be able to use these tools more. So I think that's one thing, and then working with the different tribal partners on this, and the Forest Service and them are, seeing historically how important these fires are, and working with tribes to bring back more of the prescribed burns and things like that. Another thing that we're doing is like we're working with Opal Creek Ancient Forest Center as an example, and the fire went through that area. It's reminded me of St. Malala. And we're doing, they're gonna really rework their curriculum and focus on the fire, the impacts of the fire, what are good fires and what are not so good fires. And that's gonna be kind of part of their education and curriculum that they're gonna be doing as they bring in visitors and school groups and things like that. So we're kind of working with that. Next week, I have a training with them for some teachers and things like that. So that's another kind of example.
So would it be like an opportunity, if the big fires come through, then an opportunity to bring in the smaller fire practices now that it's happened? Like, is that in people's, is that a possibility?
Yeah, and I think so, and it's really interesting because we've been working a lot in the Cascade Mountains. And so we were in a lot of the areas before they burned. Then we get to see the burn, but also there's been some areas that are re-burning with some of these fires, and we haven't had a chance to get out there and really look at that yet, but we'll be doing that hopefully this fall on some of those locations. We'll look at the fire history, see how many times it's burned and when was the last one and things like that, and kind of looking at that and seeing what's happening.
While seemingly overwhelming, are there certain areas of, say, thick forest or great underbrush that could originally be cleared and then controlled burning and continued from that point on? Could you just initially get rid of some of that underbrush, cut it all back, go through, get rid of that, and then start using the control burn as a mechanism to keep it the way it should be?
Yeah, and they've been doing some examples like that. I know there's going to be one happening in the upper Willamette River watershed, and the California tribes have been doing that a lot more. But I think there's going to be more and more of it happening. I think as they do fire restoration too, they're kind of keeping those things in mind. We're working like with different watershed councils and things where they have watersheds that have been impacted by the fires. And they're kind of taking this opportunity to look at things and how things in the landscape should be cared for, and then working with the different tribes as partners for that.
Nice.
How long have you been working with this particular aspect of tribal culture? When did you start learning about controlled fire?
Me myself, probably at least 15 years. I'm also, as I mentioned, that I do art and I do basketry and things like that, and that really connects to the land and the fires, importance of fires for like the gathering of some of the basket materials, as well as the foods, do a lot of food gathering. So I'm able to be out there on the landscape and see, like I can see meadows, where things are encroaching on like the camas fields and things like that, and some of our huckleberry areas. So I've been able to be on the landscape and really see firsthand what's happening. And then we've been doing this big project in the Cascade Mountains and just seeing the impacts of the fires these last few years also. So 2005, how many is that? Over 15 years, I guess.
It seems like a lot has probably changed
Well,
since you started.
Yeah, and that's what I was mentioning, where there's been a more awareness of how those traditional fires were important to the landscape, and you're seeing a lot more of that awareness. There's a lot more talk about it, and then people, I think folks willing to look at what are the opportunities here, and how can we bring back some of those traditional forms of fires.
As someone who works with the land, and like, it sounds like a lot of work to do that work, to remove shrubs and everything, and start, applying fire in responsible ways. And I was just wondering about, working with partners and like fire specialists in OSU and like tribal opportunities. Does it feel like the tribe is being placed in a position where opportunity for employment and participation and resources are like uplifting, to try to do that work and to interact with it in a way that's positive
Yeah.
going forward?
And like I'm hoping like here in the next year or so, we'll be able to have more fire crews. And some of them I think will be more focused on prescribed burns and things like that. So those will bring new tribal member work opportunities and things like that. There's just a great interest within the tribal members to see those kinds of things happen. So I'm hoping within the next couple of years we'll be able to have a more expanded, we'll be able to do and work with a lot more different partners. Any other questions?
I have,
Uh-huh.
you never mentioned mushrooms, was that anything that was gathered, or
Y-
is gathering?
Yeah, mushrooms, there's not a lot of historic information about the use, but we know some were used for different purposes, maybe food or medicinal, or some of like the conchs and stuff were used for making dyes and things like that. And then today we have lots of tribal members that go out and gather the mushrooms. You know, that just ties to the different types of mushrooms, where they're growing, what kind of conditions they need for that. You know, some of them are more in heavier forests, things like that. So just kind of depends on the mushroom types. Same with lichens and things like that.
I'm on a farm that has white oak savanna and then pastures, and we have livestock, and there's some camas. How does the livestock impact the camas' health?
Yeah, the biggest thing is where they'll stomp down the ground and make it hard. And what we'll do is we've seen where if we haven't been able to dig or gather camas in different areas, the bulbs are much more smaller. If there's regular use of the landscape and of gathering of those bulbs and stuff, the bulbs will be a lot more larger. But that's probably the biggest impact from the livestock. And like one of the things that we're doing is like we're working with Polk County for instance, and we just did some traditional ecological knowledge videos that we're going to use. And Polk County Soil and Water Conservation, they're going to be using those and sharing those with landowners who want to do restoration. And I've seen some examples of where a landowner has cattle, and they have natural areas. And there's one, she's in the Kings Valley area that we visited this past year. But it was pretty nice to see what they're doing and how they're rotating the cattle on a regular basis, so that ground isn't getting severely impacted. You know, they look at their cattle size too, so it's not overdoing working the landscape. And then they have a lot of natural areas, and they have a lot of beautiful kind of open savanna area. And they've just been doing that on their own. They've just been really conscious of what they're doing on the landscape there. So it was really kind of a nice little model where you can have, you know, people have a livelihood of raising cattle and things like that, but at the same time they were able to balance that with caring for the land too in a good way. There's camas there, there's cat's ear populations in different areas. There's yampa and lamashums and stuff like that are growing on their landscape. But it's been a lot of work. It's just a small family kind of farm, but the husband and wife, they've done a lot of hard work, just caring for the land and being real conscious of what they were doing, and not trying to overdo it either. You know, let the natural things happen and not try to manipulate things. And usually when people try to manipulate things, things go more wrong than they go right, it seems. So letting those natural processes kind of happen. Also being patient. That's why I said we think 7 generations ahead, and have to have that patience. For we know it's going to take some time for the land to recover and heal in some places. But knowing that it will is what keeps driving us to do things. Okay, okay, this will be last question for the day, thank you.
Post-fire, are, like, you were showing a video of the tarweed being collected, and is there, are you applying more native seeds, like, because there's such an eradication of the seed banks? Is a post-fire, there any applications of seeds, or, yeah, what do you do post-fire?
Yeah, and there's a lot of efforts to do seed collection. And then one of the things we're kind of conscious of too is, making sure that we're not taking seed from, say, Southern Oregon, trying to plant it up here in the northern Willamette Valley, because a lot of those plants have certain characteristics that have developed over time for those specific locations that there are. So we're kind of conscious of that and always mindful of that, and trying to get seed and gather seed from close by versus from far away. So those are some of the activities, and with our nursery, we kind of keep that in mind too. We're growing seed that the plants are going back to the area where the seed came from, and not along the way if we can. Okay, I would say Hayumasi, thank you everybody, and thank you for your patience today with a little mix-up at the beginning, but I really appreciate you for all hanging out and staying and sharing your questions and everything. So, Hayumasi.
Hi, Masi.